Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Attachment Network of Manitoba's brand new podcast, Reframing Addiction, the Crisis of Disconnection. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne, and I'll be your host today, and I'm joined by a very special guest today. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's great to see you. It's great to hear your voice. My name's Marion Cooper, and I am with the Canadian Mental Health Association. So this topic, of course, is really relevant to the work that we do every day.
We are very excited to have you today, Marion. And for our listeners, the purpose of our podcast series here is to explore addiction and healing through the lens of trauma and disconnection. As our communities have become more and more disconnected from healthy relationships with family, friends, and community, addictions too have become more widespread in and around our lives. We define trauma here as a lack of safety, connection, and healthy relationships. The crisis of disconnection is a trauma that we are facing in our communities, families, and our friendships. We'll be exploring how that trauma of disconnection impacts addictions, how it impacts our healing journeys, and how can we reconnect in ways to assist individuals, families, and communities that are struggling with addictions. So this is the big mission that we have before us. Marion, are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's get talking.
This sounds like a really important topic, and I'm actually very excited to hear from you and all of the work that you and your team are doing. So we'll jump right into it here. From your perspective, what does addiction look like in Manitoba specifically, and how has that landscape of addiction changed in the past 10 years?
Well, addiction or substance use disorders or trauma or mental health struggles, we think of addiction as something that is related to psychological and distress, right? And so I think our understanding of addiction and substance use disorders has changed over the last 10 years for sure. And more of us are talking about it. So more service providers are seeing the need in community and recognizing the importance of integrating approaches and ways to support communities and individuals with their struggles with addiction. And then the broader community, whether it's schools or workplaces or homes and communities, we are talking more about addiction issues and how devastating addiction can be to individuals and families. So with that increased awareness and understanding and more conversation, we're seeing some positive changes happen. But what we also see is the need is growing. People are struggling. We have many different kinds of addictions happening in our community that are being faced by individuals, and families are being impacted. So right now in Manitoba, we've seen an increase in methamphetamine addiction and how devastating that can be. A few years ago, it was crystal meth. And again, we saw huge impacts there. And then there's the old standard alcohol addiction. And, alcohol remains the biggest source of problematic substance use for our communities. And that continues to be a very serious public health issue, as well as cannabis and addressing the implications for the legalization of cannabis. And although, we are very supportive of not criminalizing substance use, but now understand the impact a little bit more around access and what that means for people who've been struggling with addiction issues and, a mainstreaming of access. And not to suggest that that was a bad policy decision, but it hasn't had an impact. And all of that, of course, in the context of the pandemic over the last year. And I know we'll talk in a little while about, well, what fuels addiction? What are the root causes? And then what's happening in our society that's making it more difficult, more prevalent, and more complicated to get the kind of treatment supports that really can support healing.
Thank you so much. I think that's a really great overview. And we're going to talk in a couple of minutes as well about kind of how COVID has changed things. But before we get into that, I'd be curious to hear from you. when we think about disconnection and the trauma that comes with it, how do you see, like, what is that relationship between trauma, between addiction? Like, let's talk root causes here. Is this an epidemic yet?
I think it is. I think it's an epidemic. I think mental illness, mental health challenges, and depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, addiction. There's so much language to describe it, but it's it's all of these things that are connected to some core things that I think get in the way of healthy, loving relationships. People connecting with their purpose and meaning. People being able to contribute and participate in a way that helps them feel those important things like self-efficacy and contribution. So in terms of trauma and what's underneath addiction issues, I believe we're wired for connection. We talk a lot about that, at CMHA, but also in our healing communities where we're, service providers and people trying to promote social and community change. We know how critical connection is and relationship is. And trauma, and there are many different kinds of trauma, but one of the effects of trauma is that it disrupts trust and connection. If it's trauma that's between someone who has caused harm, in terms of abuse to an individual, that is a devastating impact on that person's ability to form and keep healthy connections, because their ability to trust has been damaged. And so if we think about the interconnection between connection and trauma, they're so tightly connected. I think that, in the field of recovery and health and mental health and well-being, we are acknowledging that, it isn't just about treating symptoms. It's not about just throwing some medication at, a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder or, psychosis or PTSD. Of course, things like medication can be very helpful tools for people to get to a place where they can start to connect to what's going on for them and also engage in other healing approaches. There's not one solution, right? There are many pathways to well-being and to healing. But ultimately, it comes down to how do we support people to begin to connect to themselves again? And often that's been interrupted because of trauma. A person's identity can be interrupted, whether it's cultural trauma like racism, whether it's sexual abuse or assault, whether it's physical abuse or neglect. I mean, any of those adverse childhood events, but also through the life course, there's exposure to trauma along the way. And, I think the opposite of trauma is connection, right? And restoring connection. And so I think, as I said, they're very connected.
Well, it's so interesting when you think about connection and healthy relationships and people who struggle with harmful substance use. It's almost like they've lost that connection to themselves that you were mentioning and have needed a connection to any other thing that's available. And so it's like that connection latches onto the substance or the harmful behavior.
That's so true. And, I think historically there's been such moral judgment around substance use, right? And that people feel like they're bad people because they have an addiction. And that is so flawed. That is so misguided. And unfortunately, that's also steeped into helping systems, right?
It is.
People are told, deal with your addiction and then we'll help you. Well, that's not helpful. It's also very blaming, and it creates and it reinforces shame, right? But the power between understanding how that substance is helping, initially it helps people feel better. right?
It's
They help
relieving
them
the
feel
pain,
connected.
right? It
Yeah,
takes that pain
absolutely.
away.
It takes the pain away. So there's a reinforcer that's helpful, that's positive. But then how do we support our loved ones, the people that we're providing service to, or our family members, or our colleagues, or our community members, to find other reinforcers that can at least begin to kind of match some of what that reinforcer is for that substance use.
Yeah, it's
You
like you got to
know,
do the healthy swap out, right?
totally. Like, and that's exactly it. So, when I think about harm reduction, I think about relationship boosting, because harm reduction
Ah,
pathways really need to be about strengthening relationships so that we can be on that journey with that person as they try to navigate their needs and get reconnected. And so, it isn't that, okay, just stop using and then I'll help you. Well, it's coming alongside and finding ways to support people to get to healthy places where they can begin to reduce their use, but also with that important healing relationship work that we can do is to be able to support them in ways that kind of strengthen their connection with themselves, their own values, their sense of identity. That can mean cultural reclamation. It can mean finding a sense of purpose again, but also having a connection with someone who believes in them, has a sense of hope for them, can help them see future opportunities. That is harm reduction.
yes, Marion. Woo! I
Mm.
love that so much. And I'm happy we're talking about connection, but it's a really important concept as we move into this next question about the COVID-19 pandemic. So talk about connection and pain and COVID-19 and how people have been so affected and so disconnected from perhaps what at one time was a healthy relationship or a positive connection. And now because of COVID, people have to be ripped away from those like social support systems and emotional support systems.
Yeah.
And what effect have you seen this pandemic have on people's ability to connect? I think you maybe already know what my thoughts are.
Well, I've seen it for sure. I've experienced it, right? Like
Mm,
all of us are in this together. And I would say in my work life, what we've seen are so many people who, even before the pandemic, were struggling with isolation and loneliness. I mean, we were talking about an epidemic of loneliness before the pandemic, right? So if that was the pre-pandemic state for many people, how might that be now?
wow.
Amplified, right? Um,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. So the other part with that is people who've been struggling with mental health challenges or addiction issues. Um, in many ways, this has been a perfect storm, right? You are now isolated. It's harder to get the help you need because for some people the virtual experience has been great. They love it, and for others it's not enough, and they need that in-person connection, which is why we keep our doors open at CMHA always. And that is critical. So the connection has been a big part of the loss for people during this time. And I would say that if we think about even particular groups of people, older adults who, are even more afraid of the impact of the pandemic because of their vulnerability, being older, and also teenagers. The most important thing in an adolescent's life are their social connections. That trumps everything. That trumps school. That trumps, family relationships.
It's true.
It's true. I have a 16-year-old. I know. I live this. And when we had to go into shutdown, it shut down their social connections. And as much as people were connecting virtually and we saw really cool things happening, for some young people, it was very, very detrimental to their development. And what we've seen and hear from parents is some of those young people are using. They've started using during this time because they're bored. They're feeling disconnected from their friends. And guess what? Cannabis helps them escape, and it makes them feel, something other than that boredom and that relentless sense of like, what does the future hold for me? So I've been hearing from a lot of parents and have seen this, where our young people are really starting to struggle. And, it's one of the things that I think we're going to see more and more of. But the pandemic has definitely had a huge impact. On the other side, I think that the service providers and systems have added more things to the menu. And I think it's about time we're doing virtual care, right? Let's talk about low barrier service delivery. And I think as
Yes.
a result, we've seen some very quick ingenuity. And I think that's one of the silver linings in all of this. And so at CMHA, for example, our Wellbeing Learning Center, prior to the pandemic, people would come in for classes and courses. We've now been delivering courses virtually through online learning platforms. We have over 1,000 students engaged in courses here at CMHA virtually from all over Canada.
Wow.
Right?
So it's actually, the pandemic almost has increased your ability to reach more people because you've removed the barrier of that having to be physically present.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm happy you went into that, because I wanted to ask a little bit more specifically about how the pandemic has affected the great work that you folks do at CMHA. But I just quickly also wanted to respond, because you mentioned the same storm analogy, and I've been seeing really great renditions of this in and around different social media platforms. And one that I saw was, yes, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And I feel like what I love about that is it addresses the equity component of this conversation. And so so I just think that's really important. And so, like, how has CMHA changed because of the pandemic to reach out to those people that maybe are in a little more rickety of boats in this storm?
Well, unfortunately, some people don't even have a boat. Okay. So I think about my friends and colleagues and the community members on many First Nations throughout this province. And we've been talking about connectivity for a long time in First Nations. And so great, we've got these great online virtual offerings, but they can't reach people in our communities. And so that's a great example of, the storm is alive, and it's there's boats, and some people have great boats, some people have boats that are good enough, and others don't have a boat. And so we might throw them a life jacket here and there, right? So the equity issues are very, very obvious right now. So connectivity is going to be one of the important lifelines that is critical for us to continue to build through this. So we've done some work around advocacy, and we support many First Nations communities through our partnership with a number of Treaty 5 communities. So we want to continue to try and, be ready when connectivity is there, so that resources are available. And we want to make sure that we are going into communities. So even last year during the pandemic, we were still going into communities, trying to support teachers who were trying to figure out the way to connect with students. So we have this program called Thrival Kits, where we're teaching grade 4, 5, and 6 grades, young people, children, skills around resilience and mental health and well-being. But the teachers needed that too. So we found ourselves supporting teachers who, of course, need that toolkit for themselves if they're going to pass it on to the kids, right? So we're helping to try and stock the boat or make sure that the boats are available. But this is a big systemic issue, and we all need to raise our voice, and it's not good enough. It's not good enough. It's not good enough that we have to have a global pandemic to really get action on that issue of connectivity.
Yes, thank you. And that's what we're doing here, Marion. We raising the standards. And for anyone who's listening to us right now, I hope you're hearing loud and clear that between Marion, myself, and the great work of the Attachment Network here, we are asking for the folks that are listening to just do what you can to help address the inequities that we see in these systems and the services around us. And I think that connects beautifully to what I wanted to ask, because I wanted to get to the solution here. What do people actually need to support their healing process? Like, overcoming addictions is very difficult. And what do people need? Marion, tell me all the answers.
Well, it's pretty simple. I actually think people need love and to be reminded that there are people who care about them. And, there's a lot of talk about tough love and setting limits and boundaries, and there's a place for some of that, but more and more, I think we need to change the conversation to be about trying to help people connect to those relationship opportunities, to focus on the strengths, and to not accentuate where people may have, fallen or haven't been able to follow through, but to focus on the opportunities and the examples and the situations where people have shown up and they're trying. And it might be just, thanks for texting me and just staying connected because I was worried about you. That is such a beautiful gesture of love. And for us to do more and more of that. One example of a program that I think helps change the conversation is designed for families, actually. It's called CRAFT, which stands for Community Reinforcement Approach to Family Training. It's a very fancy name, but I've had the opportunity to go through the program. And this program really helps people who have a loved one who's struggling with addiction or substance use issue to change the conversation, because so often that the connection is, why are you still using? Why aren't you getting help? Or, I'm not going to give you money if this is what you're going to do with it. And, all of that unhelpful conversation. And families are struggling, loved ones are struggling, right? They want to see healing and their person doing better, but that approach doesn't work. We know that. So it's helping families and loved ones to get to a place where they can begin to change the communication style between them and the loved one, to also focus on self-care for that family. Because, families go through a lot. Communities go through a lot when they see their constituents and their loved ones struggling. There's so much burden and so much stress attached to that. So it's learning how to do self-care and how to have healthy boundaries, but also change the conversation and focus on the positive, because you want to be there to catch. You want to be the one that they're going to reach out to, and not feel like that all you communicate are your disappointments, and because that's not helpful. So that's simple, but this program CRAFT is an example of a program that supports individuals to learn how to develop communication skills that change the interaction between you and that loved one. I think more of that is really important. So
really love
one
that.
organization that's doing that right now is the Jewish Child and Family Services Organization. They're offering a CRAFT group for family members. So I would say those are examples of really simple strategies that over time can make a difference. And the research shows that for families who've been able to engage in that shift in conversation, they've seen an improvement in the willingness of that loved one to enter into treatment, and that the family members also feel healthier and less depleted and more able to take care of themselves. So it's not a quick fix, but it's a step towards.
Well, I love that so much, because you already maybe have answered my next question, because I was going to ask about what do communities have to do? Like, what does a healthy community look like? How do communities provide, a sense of like healthy support? And I feel like this CRAFT program is on the way to doing that, but I'd be curious if there was, any more thoughts you had at that community level.
Well, I think there's a lot that community can do. I think broadly, we need to have the conversation about recovery and healing. And this needs to be like just everyday conversation. And we're getting there. It's starting to happen. But there still is a lot of stigma and shame around addiction issues. We used to, in the mental health sector, we've done a lot of work around sort of addressing stigma and discrimination related to mental illness and those struggles. But addiction actually there's still a lot of shame and judgment attached to it, right? So we still have a lot of work to do. I love the recovery capital movement, where we're talking about communities coming together and celebrating recovery and celebrating the importance of seeking help and trying. And, it may take a whole bunch of tries, but let's keep supporting each other. So I think anything we can do to create a community and a culture that creates a sense of safety to talk about your issues in a real, authentic way, that's really critical. The other thing, service providers and systems and governments and people who may be listening who are involved in organizations and agencies, we need to try and keep ensuring that, there's more treatment services available and that they're free, that you don't have to pay for them, right? That money is not a barrier. And that the moment of readiness, you never know when that's going to be, right? You come down from a really bad trip, you're feeling like, okay, I've got to do something about it. You reach out for help and you're told, well, there's about a 3-month wait list. That's not helpful. And we may always have some kind of a wait, but the more we can build out the menu of services and support so that when that moment of readiness happens for someone, there's something there right away. That is critical. That is critical.
So the best thing communities can do is get ready for people to be on their healing journeys and support them.
Get ready. Yeah.
I love that
Absolutely.
so much. That's great advice. Thank you, Marion. You know me, I'm all about those grassroots community groups that are doing all the stuff on the front line, on the ground. Is there any grassroots work happening that helps to address addictions, create these healthy connections? Are there any grassroots organizations that, you're noticing right now that you want to give some love to?
Well, absolutely. There's the work that you do, Michael, and that work in the North End and the Bear Clan and all of the community groups that are about being on the streets, being connected to people, supporting people in practical ways. That work is pure love, and we need just more of that. And so, I don't think we use the language of love as much as we should, but that's what this is about. So I think growing all of that is really critical. I think the other thing that's really powerful that happens every day quietly is peer support. People
shout out to all the peer supporters out there. Yes.
Absolutely. Peer support saved my life and many others. And we don't even sometimes realize that peer support's happening, and it happens in lots of beautiful ways every day. But peer support in terms of recovery and substance use recovery in particular is powerful. And I think we need to continue to grow those opportunities for people. And, no one pathway will fit for everybody, right? So we need to create lots of pathways. And so for me, it's like it's a beautiful forest that has many pathways. And we may need different things at different times. So we need peer support. We need grassroots mobilizing. We need active offerings around treatment services. We need community organizations that are supporting people to plan for their future. We need opportunities to have safe housing, opportunities to get back into the workforce, finish high school, develop our literacy skills, build our confidence. All of this is critical for building a system of real care and love and opportunity for people to have the life that they deserve and to feel whole again.
Thank you. I love that so much. And I think just continuing on that, our last question is the big dream question. All right. I know often we get limited by, money,
Yeah.
and just limits that creates in our world. And so if money was no object, if we didn't have to worry about the financial limitations of it, what is one change that you would love to see happen today?
That's a good question. Um, you know, it's a good question because I think part of our rhetoric is that we need more money for more services. And I don't disagree with that. But I actually believe that we need to work better together.
Mm.
And that we have all these organizations and all these services and all of this community uprising. We need to come together. We need to build relationships with each other and begin to talk about how can we work together. And I don't think that's about money. There is a resource requirement. It's about commitment, energy, and reprioritizing how we manage our time. But it's a call to action to me. I'm in a position of leading an organization here in Winnipeg and in Manitoba, and I need to make sure that I am also connecting with all of the other agencies out there and saying, how can we work more closely together? But I really believe that's what this year is going to be about. We've been all retreating out of a response to a pandemic, but as soon as things open up, we need to be opening up and we need to be connecting more than ever because the community needs us. And if we're not connecting and working closely together, there's too many cracks that can happen. And the soil, when it's a really hot summer, the ground starts to crack, right?
Yep.
And that one plant is just trying to get enough water for itself, right, to survive. Sometimes organizations function like that, where that plant, we're just trying to get enough water to survive. And then all around us are these cracks, but there's other flowers and trees and things trying to survive. But if we all started coming together and sharing water, sharing resources, and supporting each other, we actually create a stable ground for growth and for all those little earthworms that are underneath all that ground to find their way and not get lost in a crack. So
I love that analogy. That's so fantastic. Marion, we've gone through all of my formal questions, but I really want to make sure to give you an additional opportunity just to say any final thoughts that you maybe have for our listeners, any thoughts on what we're doing here, reframing addiction. If there's anything else you'd like to share, please, this is your moment.
Yeah, I think we've had a great conversation, and I really am very thankful for this opportunity. I really appreciate the work of the Attachment Network. I mean, I love the Attachment Network, and before we got on our call today, I was reflecting on my connections over the years, and the Attachment Network is all about connection, which is also about this topic. And often we think about our early years and attachment, but attachment is something that's lifelong, and we need to build connections that are lifelong. And so I think that's the work that we need to do. We're at a place where we're quite fractured, and there's a lot of disconnection. And the only solution is to create connection. So that's our call to action today.
Marion, thank you so much for taking the time and for the amazing work that you do every day. But thank you for sharing with our listeners today. On behalf of the Attachment Network of Manitoba, I want to express my gratitude and my love for you and the amazingness that you bring to the world. And thank you.
Thank you.